Will call is the title of your sermon in the bulletin. It has something a little bit different. Hearing check. You can see where I was working with the same passage. Will call. What's the first thing you think about when you hear that? Think about picking up tickets, typically, don't you? You have decided you're going to go to a play, and whether it's Birmingham or New York, maybe you're going to a ball game, and you have decided rather than pick up those tickets and stand in line, where you're going to call ahead of time and have those tickets waiting on you. Or maybe a ball player friend of yours has tickets and they are giving you the tickets, and you're just going to be able to pick them up at the will call booth. Now, the way that started out was not as a will call like thinking about a telephone. It comes from an old expression where people who were in business would say, I'm going to be calling on you, rather than sending a note. It was before the telephone, and I will call on you in person. I will call on you in person. And when I saw this 1 Samuel chapter 3, I thought this relates to what we're talking about. As God may send messages through a pastor or through a friend who loves God and is trying to encourage me along, but God is more of a will call God. And if we stay in this thing long enough, then there's going to be that point where it gets very personal. He will call on us in person. He's going to come and pick up this life that He's created, and He's going to begin to carry it in ways that it's never been carried before, and it changes everything. But maybe a good agenda for us this morning is, how do you begin to know that's happening? How do you begin to realize that, hey, God is speaking to me? Did you notice Samuel's situation? Didn't know what was going on. Eli didn't realize it. So you would not be the first to begin to get these proddings of God in your life and not be able to identify them as such. And so we're going to talk about that for a few moments. You do have a little note sheet in your bulletin if you would like to use that. Sometimes that helps me, I know, to think about where I'm going with this. It personalizes it. It helps me internalize this spoken word. It makes it a more active interaction between us. And so I would encourage you to use that. You don't have to, but maybe it's a helpful tool for you. The first thing I identified in is right out of the passage. If you read your Bible, if you had your Bible open as we went through this, then you could follow this. It's just right there for us, those wonderful lessons. The first thing about the call is that it will wake us up. Samuel, he was asleep. Eli was really out of it. He didn't hear anything, but Samuel was wakened from a sleep. I'm curious about you. Are there ways in which you're asleep to God? There are a lot of different reasons that might happen. Certainly, I'm just busy. I just hadn't thought about it in a while. I haven't given it good attention. Imagine if your business was given the same amount of attention and concentration and concerted effort, if your business was given the same amount that you've given your relationship with God over the past year. Where would you be in your business? So sometimes we just go to sleep. I thought about the fact that there are different calls. There's a first call. This was a first call for Samuel. Did you hear this? That he had never heard the word of the Lord before. He'd heard of Him. But see, this is the first time where God called in person for him. And so it was a new thing, but it could be a first call like Samuel's. It could be a new, fresh call. There's a passage over in Acts that I didn't give you the reference on it, but it was a story about Philip. And Philip was very involved in a meaningful revival of sorts in the life of the early church. And there was a point where the Spirit said, okay, Philip, I need for you to go to this road on the way to Gaza. And when you go there, then you're going to find out what to do next. And so he went, and he had an encounter with an Ethiopian ruler, one from the court of Candace. And that ruler wound up carrying the gospel back to Ethiopia because of this new call, a fresh call. It's not to say that what you're doing now is necessarily bad, but there may be a tweak to that, a new turn to that. Also may be a recall. A recall. This first time it didn't take. Remember Jonah? That's one of our favorite Bible stories, Jonah and the whale. God said, I want you to go to Nineveh, Jonah. And Jonah thought, I don't want to go preach to those old Ninevites. And so he got on a boat, literally going the opposite direction. And of course, we know the story about the big storm that came up, and there was a point where they started casting lots to see who the bad guy was. They always believed that if you were in danger, it was because of sin. And so they looked for the person who was out of sync with God, and the lot fell on Jonah. And he said, I'm the one. I'm running from God. And they thought, oh, no. Jonah said, throw me overboard. They said, no. They began to get rid of all the cargo to make room in hopes of saving the ship. But finally, they were still going down. And as a last resort, they threw Jonah overboard. Remember the story? And then he was swallowed by the big fish. It doesn't actually say whale. It just says big fish. And then he was carried and spit up on the beach. And as after 3 days, it's a resurrection. Jesus was in the belly of the whale. Or Jesus was in the tomb 3 days. And so you get that sort of a recall. He didn't get it the first time, and so now he's on the beach, and he still smells like whale vomit, which is not a real good thing. And he's probably bleached out, and I'm sure the people saw this guy walking up, when he's been in the belly of a whale, and they're thinking, what is this? And God says, okay, Jonah, would you go and talk to the people at Nineveh? And he said, yeah, sure, I'd love to. It's amazing how sometimes the Lord can be persuasive in those ways. For a little bit, you can be a little bit like the frog that's put in the cool water, and they begin cooking the water, and you don't realize it until you're cooked one day that you just went to sleep on God. And so maybe there's a recall that goes on in our life. How does God do that? How does he get our attention? How does he call us a first time, a new time, perhaps a recall? How does he do that? Might be a heart attack. God can get your attention in a lot of different ways. It might be a job that just gets transferred out from under you. And all of a sudden, there you are, very vulnerable. In our community, we know people they're dealing with that. How does God get our attention? Sometimes it can be times of adversity. Sometimes it may be a marriage that just disintegrates right out from under you, and you're having to rethink who you are and what you're doing. And God, what is it that you're trying to do in my life? 911. I'm sure there were some people who had some religious experiences on a plane this week, and that turned into a boat somewhere along the way. Second thing I thought about when I thought about this call of God, if you're trying to identify it, it's going to get personal. That call is going to get very personal. You notice he called his name in verses 4, 6, 8. God knew Samuel's name. God knows your name. God knows where you live. God knows what you're good at. God knows what you struggle with. He knows your painful past. He knows your glorious future. And so God, being that way, can do some things, use you in ways that you never could have been used if it had just been a perfect path. But he knows you personally, and he comes to you personally. He involves your entire story in the redemptive work. Remember that little verse from Romans 8:28? God causes all things. Now, he doesn't cause all things. He causes them to work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. And so God's going to involve your story. I wanted to share just a little something. This week, obviously, we have been following a story that actually upstaged the presidential inauguration preparations. After logging some 19,000 hours of acclaimed but anonymous service in the skies, Chesley B. Sullenberger III became a hero in a New York minute. On January 15th, the pilot known as Sully safely guided all 155 passengers and crew aboard a U.S. Airways Flight 1549 to an emergency water landing in the city's frigid Hudson River after the Airbus's 320 engines apparently shut down after sucking in a flock of birds. New York Governor David Paterson hailed his exploits as the miracle on the Hudson.